and a good day to students, teachers, and the generally curious to episode 6 of the Constitution in American Life with the Friends of Publius, where we shall discuss the concept of state governments acting as laboratories of democracy. Well, it has now been determined who shall represent the AFC and NFC in the Super Bowl, and we must congratulate Dr. Williams on finally having one of his teams, well, kind of one of his teams, enjoy the ultimate success by earning its way into the national championship game. The last time in one of his teams, the Raiders, the Giants, or the Bulls, saw the inside of a stadium or arena for a championship game, well, Dr. Williams still had a full head of hair. So, yeah. Okay.
Ow.
Well,
Ow.
well, we all know that the larger purpose of the Constitution of American Life is to advocate and support civic education. Civic education is important if for no other reason than to hold our elected and appointed leaders accountable. At minimum, we should expect that those who are going to lead and represent our government should have some basic knowledge of our system. But as we've seen in a more recent president, when that president expressed surprise that Lincoln was a Republican, and two, that if Lincoln had been a good president, he would have negotiated peace before the Civil War broke out there. More recently, we had a governor of a neighboring state of our own, Professor Kavanaugh, reveal their own ignorance of American history and constitutional government by stating the following in regard to the immigration issue confronting our borders. Here's the quote. Texas and the original 13 colonies would have never signed the treaty that formed the first Constitution of the United States if they didn't think that the right to protect themselves was protected. I wouldn't even know where to begin to break this down. Suffice it to say that these examples prove to me that the importance of civic education is greater maybe today than at any time in my life. What I am wondering is the state of Texas actions on immigration at the southern border an example of a state acting as a laboratory of democracy? To find out, let's turn to our expert panel to break down the role of and the relationship between the national and state governments in our federal system. So, Professor Moore, would you say that by dividing sovereignty between the states and national government, that the framers had some notion of this idea that states would act as laboratories of democracy? And I have a follow-up to that, but we'll deal with that first.
Yeah, I think that that's a fair assumption. I mean, at the writing of the Constitution, there's like 150 years of local self-experiment. I mean, to the quote here is about experimentation. Will states be these labs of tinkering with the system? So there's a 150-year legacy of state colonies and then eventually states acting on their own. Both, and I would say in two categories. There's like, for example, constitutional creation, there's variations. I mean, there's the model where state legislatures write a constitution and it's just, there it is, it's by fiat. There's the Pennsylvania model where they spend a lot of time thinking about we need a constitution, but they're not happy with, they don't want a legislature writing the constitution, so they have a convention. And then once the convention creates that constitution, it becomes the law. And then there's the Massachusetts model where it says, no, we're going to have, we want a constitution, we're going to have a convention, and it's going to go through popular ratification. So in constitutional creation, there's experimentation, is my point. And certainly in policy, there's all kinds of variations in voting procedures and policies. Property requirements vary from state to state. There's even a variation of abolitionism. Most of it's gradual, although in Massachusetts it was immediate. So at the policy level, there's a lot of experimentation too. I mean, executive councils, unicameralism or bicameralism. So all of that is at a, I would call, say, at a policy level, there's experimentation. But my original point is there's also experimentation in how we get a constitution. So yeah, I think the founders, the people that wrote the Constitution knew that there would be a fair amount, a lot of
Well, to keep you in
experimentation
your
at the state
comfort
level.
zone, so as this plays out for like the first 100 years, would it be fair to say that they also saw that the national government would provide some inspiration to state governments for reform, constitutional policy reform, or was this a one-way street? States being states would do that, but the national government would not.
Yeah, I think the legacy of state sovereignty is going to trump any notion of top down. We'd like you to try these things. I mean, things change radically after the Civil War, especially in the 20th century with the incorporation and growth of federal bureaucracy. So I think the legacy of state sovereignty precludes any top down suggestions of how states ought to do things.
Well,
Think about this. One of the first fascinating things that occurs in the 1790s is the reaction against the Alien Sedition Acts. Both Madison and Jefferson write these the New Jersey, the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions, and in both of those, there's a suggestion that states. Now, Madison says a group of states could get together and nullify. Jefferson saying a single state can. So there's that powerful legacy of state sovereignty that's still in play. To your point, the first 100 years, I think it's the state sovereignty legacy that prevents top down.
Chris?
Gibbons v. Ogden. But just throw that out there. I mean, because you will see some, and I'm going to agree with Tim mostly, but not 100%. I do think you will see some top down when you get to Chief Justice John Marshall and some of his decisions.
Yeah, commercials. Chris is right on commercial is the big exception. That's right.
Well, and what if he would have ruled the other way in Barron v. Baltimore?
Right.
I mean, what if he would have interpreted the Fifth Amendment to protect you against the city of Baltimore? I mean, that decision, holy smokes, that changed so much. Or not change it. It doesn't. But it sets us on a course that we're still dealing with, I think. So there is some top down.
I mean, they were nervous about experimentation in the West. I mean, we on a previous episode, we talked about the ins and outs of the Northwest Ordinance. They were a little nervous about experimentation out there, but I think they assumed on the whole a lot of state experimentation.
And Tim, do you think they really would have been, just in terms of like voting, right? Giving it up to state legislatures? Did they really expect that there to be all like different manifestations of voting?
Yeah, I mean that was a trade-off. I mean, the Constitution allows states to set time, place, manner of their local of the elections for the national government. So there's a great deference there to state policy, right?
So, Professor Kavanaugh, it seems that the question that the students and teachers have to deal with, that it reads that the structure of federalism is only one contributor to the notion of this experimentation or laboratory of democracy. It seems to imply that there are others. Do you agree with that reading, understanding of the question? And if so, what might be some other contributing factors?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm not sure that I see that there, but I do think, and I don't know. I'm hoping I'm to address this, but I always go back to that last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. Tim sold me on the word sovereignty years ago, and that whole idea of sovereign. Who is sovereign? Is it the king? Is it Parliament? Is it the colonies? And if you look at that last paragraph in the Declaration of Independence, free and independent states, not only independent of Great Britain, but we're also independent of each other. Because we're independent of each other, we can do the same things that basically nations can do. We can levy war, we can conclude peace, we can treaties, conduct business. So there's a whole idea of state sovereignty that we're moving from the Declaration into the Articles, and then from the Articles to the Constitution. We switch obviously it's a huge change, but you look at the arguments during the ratification debates, and even see the Federalists kind of throwing bones to the Anti-Federalists that say, no, states are still going to be able to maintain certain power. It's not going to be wholly federal. It's not going to be wholly national. Madison in 39 and 14, I think, lays this out in Federalist Papers. So I think, back to your original question, David, are there other things besides federalism that allow for state sovereignty? I think there are all kinds of things, even in the Constitution. Think about amending the Constitution. That's going to be for the states. You think about election to the Senate. That's going to be from state legislatures originally. So there are all kinds of issues within the document itself where the states still have not necessarily an inordinate amount of power, but certainly share in the power itself. Even though we know, as we've said on previous programs, not what Madison wanted, but it's what Madison got.
Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, I would add that maybe judicial review at the state level is another way that you can practice experimentation. I mean, there are some countries in the world that, like, it's just one court, right? It's a national court that decides whether acts are unconstitutional. And with Marbury, kind of solidified that it's within the realm of courts. So that's any court can rule an act by a state legislature or national legislature unconstitutional. I think that's also a way where you could get experimentation in terms of what courts are doing in terms of their judicial review power.
Well, and I was also, go ahead, Tim.
Well, when you sent those questions out and I saw this second question in, I went down a rabbit hole. Because, it's just, the term is cultural federalism, or sometimes it's called ethno-federalism. What's happened, and Mike probably knows a heck of a lot more about this than I do, that like post-colonial, where you have nations that are coming out of colonialism and you've got different ethnic groups within the country, like Serbia was a good example of this. Under the communist regime, you had these regions, and they practiced this federalism that acknowledged ethnic groups or cultural groups that could operate in their own sphere, and they could, to this question about experimentation. So this idea of cultural federalism, which kind of the anti-federalists are arguing, this country's too big, we're too divided, we have all these different groups, there's North, there's Middle, there's South, we're different peoples. And so the anti-federalists were kind of raising this cultural argument, and they were wondering whether it could operate within a federal republic. And the Federalists say, yeah, don't worry about it. But this idea of cultural or ethno-federalism is quite fascinating to me. And if that's a part of this equation of, other than the distribution of political power, it's the distribution of ethnic or cultural identity operating within a political system. I mean, Mike, am I wrong on this description, or?
Dave, you want to chime in?
Well, I just wanted to say, I came to that conclusion. It's probably, my left-leaning, expansive reading of the Constitution, also works in the reading of these questions. But I looked at the word contribute, and I was thinking to contribute something, in my view, is that there might be a multiplicity of contributors there. Yeah. And I was thinking, and I think you kind of implied this, Chris, the First Amendment, all right, seems to allow for multiple voices to contribute. And then I from that, I went to NGOs, non-governmental organizations across state lines, as we look at the abolitionists, which is not necessarily about state and federal, but it's this, broader organization, I think, that crosses state lines that might contribute to that. So that's kind of why, or how I read it, Chris. And it could be, again, a crazy reading of it. So
Mike, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, the part of the quote that I was going down the rabbit hole on was experimentation. And this notion of, like, we do experiments to learn something, to know whether we want to do it in the whole country or whether we should just not do it, right? And I think we can talk later about whether that's actually the way the federal system is working in practice. But also, to Tim's point, the term for this, I think, Tim, is It's called asymmetrical federalism. And there are some countries, India's done this, Canada is a good example with Quebec, where they don't treat all the provinces or the states equally. Like Quebec has certain rights, cultural rights, that only are for the Quebecois, right?
Yeah.
The same thing in India. There's been, I think, Khmer. I'm forgetting the provinces. Um, we don't do that, at least formally, in the United States. But that to me is where it actually serves as to not allow experimentation. It's not like those in Quebec are experimenting with having all of their signs in French to see if that's going to spread to the rest of Canada. It's really a way, that cultural notion is a way to protect, or I don't know, lift up some cultural groups and say, please stay in the union, even if we're going to allow you to do things a little differently. Not that we want it to spread. And maybe there was asymmetrical federalism with slavery, in terms of a way to keep it
Yeah.
contained, but say, please stay in the union.
But doesn't South Africa do this a little bit by acknowledging tribal law, within a larger federal structure?
They do, but they allow it for all the different provinces to practice it. It would be like this idea of asymmetrical is like when it's just one or two provinces out of the whole that get this special
Okay.
protection. Yeah.
Well, and the other thing, just to go back to Dave's original question, well, no, I mean, I think, Tim, your point on this ethno-federalism, or what asymmetrical, which I'm still trying to figure out, that Mike added, is good stuff. But, in the idea of using Barron v. Baltimore as an example, the federal government, you have very, 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 as a citizen, for the longest period of time, even to this day, you don't really bump into the federal government on a daily basis, right? You're rubbing shoulders with the local and state government. So the idea that the national government is somehow coming in and dictating to states for a long period of time, until perhaps 1860, and then from 1865 to 1877, then after Reconstruction is over, the states are back to doing their own thing again for a period of time. So there's not a lot of, for the average citizen, there's not a lot of this with the national government.
Well, I got to say that having known you guys for a long time and doing this program now, we're going into our fourth year of doing this. I got the greatest, distinction, or the distinction made between historians and political scientists. Cultural federalism, the simplicity of that, as compared to asymmetrical federalism and the complexity of that. Wow. I mean, that just told.
And who says we don't have any humor on this show?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I loved it. That was no, not at all there. So
Two asymmetrical provinces walk into a bar.
One gets 3.2 beer, one gets 6.0 beer.
Yeah.
Take off, you hoser.
Okay, there we are, teachers. There's our sense of humor for the year. So, Professor Williams, the notion of experimentation seems to come. This is again a view that I came across in reading. It seems to come. The source of it is either as a progressive energy within state governments to expand, expand democracy and rights, or a reaction to congressional and or executive inaction or indifference. Would you agree that those tend to be the sources of experimentation throughout our history?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think so. I mean, unless there's, when you say inaction, so I'm thinking.
I'm looking at Texas right now. What Texas is doing, whether it's experimentation, I don't know, but the motive for what they are doing, all right, and if if this is upheld, all right, will radically change the whole federal nature or the whole constitutional structure here, is, from what I understand, is motivated by the inaction of the national government to address a responsibility that theoretically is theirs. and that is to regulate the southern border. There, does that make sense?
It does, yeah, that makes sense of an action. I don't know, is nullification, or is just like states just thumbing their nose at the national government? That might be the only third way, unless that's included in what you were saying right there.
No, that's a good point. Their interposition or nullification. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Going on. So yeah.
I think those are the ways it can happen. I think as I was thinking about this, I was just thinking about how the contours of federalism have never been static, right? We've been arguing about this since the convention, if not before, and then with the 10th Amendment. And we've gone through these different periods. Scholars point out these different periods of federalism. So the extent to which states have the ability to experimentation is going to kind of depend on which time period you find yourself in, I think, and whether they're reacting to or they're pushing forward. I think throughout, I know there's a question come up in this, so I don't want to jump too far on it, but much of our history, I think it's been a conservative reaction by states to kind of push back, like the federal government, national government wants us to do too much. But we also have periods like right now in California, right? We got a waiver from the national government in terms of what we can do with our environmental policy, in terms of what we're asking industries to do within the state. And it's having a huge impact on the rest of the country, right? Because California is so big. And if California decides that we're only going to we only can buy cars that have certain emission rates or no emission rates, even that's just for California, it's going to change the whole industry. So I think you're seeing more states do it, not from just the kind of pushing back, but like trying to push forward, I guess. I would use the word forward, forcing the rest of the country to do something that maybe they're not ready to do.
Yeah, the speed limit and alcohol. I mean, you just at top down, we want to drive 85 yeah. So I think the pocketbook either encourages experimentation or discourages. We don't like that kind of experimentation, so we're going to cut you off on the pocketbook. Yeah.
Right. Did that answer your question? I think so.
No, yeah, you did. I just, now that you've made me think about it, maybe I'm trying to think is there other example beyond what Texas, to a degree, Arizona had done beforehand, and California before that on immigration? I'm trying to think, is there other examples?
Yeah, I mean, I would, Tommy Thompson in Wisconsin got a waiver in terms of welfare to work, that was used as the template that Newt and Clinton could agree upon to reform the entire system. So I think that's another example. Wisconsin, I think that was in the early 90s. They got a waiver. So that's another one I was thinking about.
Yeah. So I just, like I said, this notion of inaction or indifference by the national government, I don't know if I have a lot of examples beyond what I see happening in Texas right now, but maybe the Wisconsin thing about the welfare system at that time in our history.
Well, can I just give one more? I mean, like with the Affordable Care Act, a lot of states are given the option of whether they're going to expand Medicaid or not, right? And I forget how many, but it's a pretty good group of states that have just said that they're not going to expand Medicaid, and that's having huge implications for American citizens. Like, depending on where you live, it's going to depend on what kind of benefits you're getting. This happens in the education sector as well. There's a book that we'll put in the resources by Don Kettle called Divided States of America. And his thesis is that if you look at the inequality that's in the United States right now, like, he makes the argument that we should blame federalism in terms of the inequality in terms of education, health outcomes, and a lot of other things. So that's what I would.
Mike, you mentioned Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. I mean, before it was known as that, it was known as Romney Care.
That's right.
When Romney was governor of Massachusetts and instituted that type of reform within the state of Massachusetts. You talk about experimentation, and then that model was taken nationally. So, it starts at the state level and moves into a national program, which then again comes back to our baked into our DNA that, oh, it's coming from the national government. Well, we don't like it, even though it starts in the state,
Yeah.
goes to the national, back to the states. We don't want that Medicare.
Right.
I'm also thinking about the whole temperance movement was kind of experimenting in the various states before it went national. Well, the women's suffrage movement also was kind of percolated upward from state action. So I think those two movements might serve as an example of experimentation, and then it filters upward.
The women's movement, though, that became out of necessity because they weren't getting traction at the national level. So you end up, of
Right.
course,
Right.
show up. Wyoming's just trying to get people to show up because they just need some people.
So, Professor Moore, cynics like myself would argue that this laboratory concept is a two-sided coin. As well as being laboratories for democracy, state governments have also been laboratories of tyranny and injustice. In your view, does history support me or reject my perspective?
Well, I think it depends. I think there's been
That's your phrase. That's your phrase.
Well, I also like getting your goat too. So
So your answer is going to be asymmetrical right now, or
yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt. Well, I mean, this is interesting because Madison, he looked at all the shenanigans of the states in the 1780s, and it was tyrannical to him for creditors to be, duped out of what they were owed. So I mean, and then you go to the whole issue of civil rights and so yeah, states can be very obstructionist and actually draconian in terms of how they want to run things or how their experiment unfolds. But also you have in the 20th century the whole legacy of incorporation and the federal government saying, look, there's a federal minimum that you have to abide by through the incorporation doctrine. So I guess my thought is it kind of cuts both ways. Yes, states can kind of be the beacon that maybe the federal government should take some ideas from the state and expand liberty. And then also there's contraction of liberty that takes place at the state level as well. So I don't know that I would say there's a clear, easy answer both ways, either way on that.
Chris or Mike?
I would answer your question with one word: yes. I mean, as Tim said, I mean, it happens. History is full of examples of, tyranny the majority at the state level, but also states experimenting with certain things that maybe people at the national level will be opposed to. So I think that's it goes both ways. And I think if you look at Brandeis's dissent, and I mean, his language reminds me right before we get to he sets up this whole metaphor in his dissent. So I hope the students read his dissent, the entire thing, because he sets up this whole metaphor before he gets to that thing. And he channels a little Bob Ross prior to that, because he said, what does he say? It's one of the happy incidents of the federal system. So I think like there are no, just they're happy accidents, right? So it's one of the happy incidents of the federal system, that one courageous state kind of thing. So it cuts both ways, and our history is filled with those examples.
Yeah, and maybe I'm clouded by more recent events, but I look at what's coming out of state governments these days. The whole anti-woke movement, which when it translates is to me a war on education, especially history education, but gender legislation, abortion legislation, and voting rights legislation in the negative. So that's probably why I tend to lean, and I'm not so sure that states are all that when it comes to progressive ideas, especially if we look at Reconstruction you know, following that, what's Reconstruction? Well, there's laboratories, all right, you know, to destroy what was really a new constitutional framework and to undermine that in so many ways. Mike, you were going to
I mean,
add.
that's what I was just gonna to put a pin in, is that the 14th Amendment is a clear, I think, expression of the drafters of that amendment had said, okay, we've had enough with states getting away with this tyranny of the majority. But then we know that the period after that, and I mean, in my estimation, it's been a very small window of American history where actually the national government has really told states, you can't do some of the stuff you're doing. We had a window for that, but those windows are quickly shut, and we go back to I think our natural state of being, which is the states have sovereignty and the states get to choose what they want to do within their boundaries.
And Mike, a good point on the 14th Amendment, because if the students hopefully look at this case, I mean, it is a 14th Amendment case about new state ICE and the ability of the state to give licenses for people in control of a business during the Depression. So it's the 14th Amendment is in the heart of this case as well.
So, Chris, let's do a case study. Let's play along and look at I think some contemporary issues. To what degree does the Obama administration's willingness to allow Colorado the freedom to experiment with legalized marijuana, and on the other end, the rejection by the federal government for almost 10 years of Oregon's Death with Dignity Act represent the challenges and debate over states acting as laboratories?
I'm sorry, I don't recall. I can't. No, short-term memories. No.
Are you from Colorado? Is that why you can't
No.
recall, or what's?
No, it's you know, I think that's the idea of experimenting, and now we're talking about weed. That's pretty funny. You know, it just shows, you know, for students, hopefully you guys realize this, that, you know, marijuana is still listed as a Division I controlled substance, but you still have legislation even put out by Chuck Schumer trying to get it through and trying to decriminalize it at the national level, but it's still on par with like heroin, which is, you know, obviously pretty silly. And over half the population today, just over 50% of the population lives where marijuana is illegal, either recreationally or medicinally. But the government still has the authority, if they wanted to come in and shut that down. Therein lies an issue with the marijuana business because of insurance, payroll, all things that normal businesses would get to do. So there's a concern there because that's like Damocles' sword still hanging over their heads, because if you get a different administration in and they want to come in and put this, you know, the stops to that marijuana, I think they can.
But you point, and just wanted to commend you. You pointed out how fairly fast within the context of history the attitudes towards marijuana have changed, in which it's not, I mean, the majority of Americans, now whether that geographically, how that plays out, but even more and more states, you know, since Colorado have legalized.
When I talk about that's not just states. I think there are 23 states, but those states have more people. So when I talk about over 50% of the population, not just states, but over 50% of the population live where weed is legal, either medically or recreationally. Now it's interesting when you go back to the case about death with dignity. That was a different. Well, both. There are two cases. I'll put them in the resources. One is Gonzalez v. Raich, which Antonio Gonzalez, or was it Antonio or Roberto Gonzalez, who
Roberto Gonzalez,
AG for the Bush administration, is involved in both of those cases, and so they carry the Supreme Court sides with the national government, therefore giving the ability to come down and shut down, you know, a marijuana business as it stands. But they lost, I thought, in the death with dignity case in Gonzalez v. Oregon because of not being able to get it. As I understand,
you know what? I think you're right. They did lose, but it was who was Ashcroft was the attorney general that started the battle to some degree.
Yeah, it was. But the case is called Gonzalez v. Oregon.
Right, right.
I think the question was, did the Controlled Substance Act authorize the Attorney General to ban the use of controlled substances for physician-assisted suicide? And the majority said no. So you end up with the state being able to have that, what Oregon would refer to as the death with dignity law. The common name is physician-assisted suicide, but Oregon calls it the death with dignity law. And so in both those cases, David, those states are serving as those laboratories that Brandeis talked about. And obviously, Colorado, the first state to legalize recreational marijuana, they're not going back. My goodness, they're making so much money in their state coffers by taxing the heck out of that stuff.
Yeah, and what's interesting, that it hasn't played out quite as well in California, which is about the system that legislation set up, for that commercial legalization. Plus, California and its laws allow counties to not to bar commercial. Again, I can consume it, but I can't sell it in a commercial business in my county.
That's
All
why
right.
Montana is the same way. I mean, much like holy smokes, just like kind of like prohibition, where you had dry counties. You have that now in certain states like California, Montana being the same. I mean, I live in North Dakota, but it's South Dakota, Montana, and Minnesota. All the surrounding states now have moved towards recreational or medical marijuana. We have medical marijuana, but my goodness, we've dragged our feet. Our legislature's dragged its feet so much that you'd be hard pressed to find a dispensary.
Yeah, and then juxtapose that against what with the Death with Dignity Act, is that's gone pretty much nowhere. I mean, even California, twice the voters of California have voted down initiatives to allow for a similar Death with Dignity Act, and I find it so interesting, given the Battle of Oregon, that it has not spread. The experiment, although successful in Oregon, has not spread to the same degree that marijuana did.
Well, but I think that's exactly what Brandeis is talking about. And I think I always go back to, bloody Kansas. The whole idea of the pre-Civil War in 1850, we're going to let popular sovereignty decide, and yet you have pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups funding these folks to show up in Kansas, where the Civil War perhaps begins 10 years earlier than the formal, 1861, with the debate over whether or not Kansas will be free or enslaved territory, which is not unlike what you guys experienced in California with Prop 8 a few years ago. When Proposition 8 was on the ballot for same-sex marriage, you get a ton of outside money, as I understand it, pouring into your state, trying to sway the vote one way or the other. And oh my gosh, there's some incredible commercials that played out on your media.
Well, it's the first time, and I know this, very, directly. It's the first time, at least I've been told this by members of the LDS church, that they decide to get really politically active. All right, to make sure that gay marriage is not. But they've got, but they will have a negative experience by getting politically active, and I explained to them, hey, you want to get into the political arena, then you got to be prepared that people are going to come after you, which is exactly what happened. And so I don't know if a lot of members of the LDS really want to get that politically active nationally in areas kind of thing because of that experience. But that's a very good point.
For the students watching, LDS is Latter-day Saints, or otherwise known as the Mormon Church out of Utah, and they did spend a lot of money,
millions,
in California trying to sway that debate over Proposition 8, where Proposition 8 on the California ballot was whether or not the voters of California would like to legalize same-sex marriage. And so you see all this outside money pouring into the state trying to sway it. And it's much like Mike was saying earlier in terms of like cars and electric cars, because California is such a huge economy, and businesses are going to tailor, that what they produce to sell in a large market like California. So it was a somewhat similar issue there with Proposition 8 back in, gosh, when was that? Was that in the late 80s, guys?
90s. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise again this idea, this language of experimentation and laboratories. It's like scientific language, right? And to me, it's this ideal of like, oh, we'll get some data points, we'll talk about it, and whatever the best course of action is, we will, as rational beings, will choose that. And I don't know if there's ever been a time in our history where that's the way it's worked.
But
Seems like-
it's very much a reflection of progressivism in in the early part of the 20th century. That it's a very scientific,
I
kind
get
of
it.
approach.
I'm just saying it's kind of like we talk about the First Amendment as the marketplace of ideas, and we have a bunch of assumptions there about what the marketplace is supposed to do. I just we don't have a mechanism in our politics, I don't think, where it's like the governors associations, do they really, when they get together, are they really trading notes of like, hey, this is the way we're legalizing marijuana, and maybe that is happening at some level. It seems to me that it's much more where the issue of polarization gets in the way of that experimentation, because it's all just about wins and losses. It's so zero sum. It's like, oh, of course California wants to do that. It's because they're a blue state, right? Well, of course Alabama's going to do that because it's a red state. And we're missing out on what's supposed to be this benefit of having a federal system.
I think there's one, as I understand it, Biden's initiative to broker for lower drug prices. I think that was kind of experimentation at the state level. So it seems to me that's kind of a trickle up, that states have been doing that for a while. And that seems to be one of those laboratory things that actually seem to function in that way that we're talking about, in this scientific clinical analysis way that it trickled upwards.
Well, and similar to, Tim alluded to earlier about, voting rights for women, which, the national approach wasn't working. So the associations took it on a more state by state basis, Wyoming obviously being the first. But I would also say, Mike, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a conservative kind of think tank, which will actually write legislation that will be implemented at the state level. Let's face it, obviously Congress is notorious for not getting a lot done, more so lately than ever. But what the ALEC has understood is that we can actually tailor our laws, and we can write them for on a state by state basis. And they've been very effective at getting legislation done that way.
Yeah.
It actually is a national organization, but we're approaching it state by state that way. So, and I'm not sure, there's not a lot of experimentation, because holy smokes, we've got guys that have introduced stuff at the state level that still has the ALEC letterhead on top of the stuff that they've introduced. So, and David, you brought up the border. I want to say this about the border.
Well, I want to ask. I want to help me out. Does that fall into Brandeis category? What's going on in Texas right now? Is that experimentation? Is that a laboratory? As
I think it falls more into the Joseph Heller model of Catch-22. Joseph Heller wrote a book with the students. It's called Catch-22. Fantastic read. Hopefully you read it at some point. But the idea is, okay, we have a Congress whose job constitutionally is to write laws dealing with immigration, right? It's in the Constitution, Article 1, right? Section 4, maybe. I don't know, check that. But so it's a constitutional duty to do these things, but the Congress is not doing its duty. Therefore, the state of Texas can say, well, Secretary Mayorkas, you're not doing your job, so we're going to, the Congress is going to say, we're going to impeach you because you're not doing your job. But the idea is we end up with a Congress that doesn't do anything. And then the state of Texas can say, well, wait a minute, you guys aren't doing anything on immigration, therefore we have to take action. So it is this catch-22. If Congress were simply to do its job, then we wouldn't have to worry about this. But also there's the politics that are driving this, because last time I checked, we have California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. No, maybe not Nevada, on the southern border. Do we have any of those other states in the news? I don't think so. So
well,
there's
maybe who knows? Well, first of all, yeah, we do, Chris, in the sense that Arizona tried this, not to the same degree. Clearly, the governor of Texas is going, a whole nother level versus what Arizona had done a few years back, versus what California attempted to do in the 1990s with Prop 187. So there are some experimentations there along the southwestern border, kind of thing. And Texas is now just taking it, I think, because of inaction by the national government. Texas is providing a model for California, for Arizona, New Mexico, of how they might want to approach this down the line, especially if Texas is successful here. Mike?
Yeah, to me, I mean, the flip side of this is it's not at a state level, maybe, but sanctuary cities. When cities started saying we're not going to allow the national government to come in and enforce immigration laws and deport folks, like, you know, who are DACA or whatever. Like, I think it's the flip side of that, and it seems to me like this level, the type of experimentation you're doing, the final arbitrator on that is the courts, right? The federal courts. And I think that, I mean, this is where the politics gets involved. And as the courts have become more conservative, I think the governors like Governor Abbott is like, okay, I'm willing to take my shot in federal court on this, right? It's kind of like the way the courts have stepped in to say, this is the way you can regulate under the Second Amendment, states, right? If at all. This is the way you can regulate privacy with DAW. I mean, everyone's just going to go at it now, put in their legislation, and then it's going to go to the courts to say, what have we passed some constitutional boundary on what you can experiment with? So I do think it's an example. I think what Abbott's doing is we're going to get that just as much as we're going to get legalizing marijuana.
Just real quick, Mike, is there a state that has declared itself a sanctuary, or is it all?
I don't think so. That's what I'm saying. I think it's just cities within states.
So can cities be laboratories of experimentation?
I mean, cities are a crucial part of our federal system, it seems to me. So yeah, I mean, I think so.
Madison kind of does its own thing, quite independent of the rest of the state of Wisconsin. It's kind of, not only is it a sanctuary city, it's well, just an anecdote here. There was a family that was walking down the street a couple years ago. They were bringing their 17-year-old to see the campus, and it was naked bike day. And so there was a policeman on the street, and this mom was duly upset. Mr. Officer, police officer, could you arrest these people? And he said, well, we just kind of do things differently here in Madison, ma'am. So, I mean, Madison is kind of an entity to itself. Now, in a legal sense, maybe not, but certainly in a cultural sense, you have all kinds of experimentations going on within states, and I can't believe that Wisconsin and Madison is the only instance of that.
The People's Republic of Madison?
People's Republic, yes.
Well, I think that's true, though. I think you see that sometimes. What Mike said about cities, for sure, because you'll see cities that will take action that may be contrary to what comes out of the state legislature, and then the state legislature, who's big on local control, they're big on local control as long as the people in these local municipal governments are going along with what they want. Because we've seen some stuff in Fargo where Fargo has gotten shut down by our state legislature because that's not what the state legislature wants.
So I guess the homework for all of us and students and teachers is, can you find an issue that began at a city level, then it spread in its state, and the legislature mimics what the city's doing, and then it goes national? Is there any time in history where something started that local and then did become kind of a national cultural thing there? I'm just wondering there. So Mike, we got to change direction here, and that is to look globally, act locally, but to look globally here. And I'm wondering, in other constitutional republics in which you have provinces or states, if it's accurate to say that America has allowed far more freedom and influence of state governments than others countries with provinces and states in constitutional democracies. Is that an accurate thing to say, or are other countries just as likely to have the kind of experimentation that we do?
Oh, I didn't think about this. Okay. I wasn't thinking about it from experimentation. I was just thinking about it in terms of like formal powers, in terms of their room. And the answer to that question is yes. I think, it goes back to Tim. I think it kind of depends on which period we're in, right? I think that federalism has never been static. And depending on what period we find ourselves in, I think there's more room, right? But yes, in terms of like over the vast part of our history, the United States, our states have had much more power than other federal systems. The only the Germany's an example where the lander in Germany, they have a lot of power to do things at that level. And anything that they are not, anything that the federal government that says they can't do, it goes back to those states, which is like what our system does. Canada and South Africa, Australia, if something is unmentioned, it goes to the national government. Um, I also found something now. I need to double check this because I need to find another source. But I did find one source that in Germany, um, that the German states have the right to act on their own at the international level, and that this actually kind of came from a original negotiation with the Kingdom of Bavaria when they joined the German Empire in 1871. So I don't know to the extent that the German states actually do this, and I need to double check another reference on it. But that was something where I was like, wow, that really can happen. That's a lot more power than we have, or maybe not. Maybe that's what Abbott's gunning for. Maybe Abbott's gonna hold a summit and have a treaty with Mexico.
Well, I thought we dealt with that back in Philadelphia in 1787. That fear of states going off on their own, and
You mean the treaty we did with Texas and the
yeah,
13
the treaty
colonies?
that we
Yeah.
did with Texas and other colonies. Yes, that's
Uh,
right. Mike Tim or Chris.
Yeah,
did they-
I'm trying to think of you know, in terms of internationally, I'm not sure how that works in terms of parliamentary sovereignty versus local control. I'm going to defer to Mike in terms of other countries,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure.
I do think it's interesting, like to Tim's point about this idea of more cultural federalism. India is an example, South Africa is definitely an example, that the Constitution allows provinces to have the latitude to determine things like in South Africa, polygamy can be legal in your province if the province says it is. Customary laws. So customary laws in South Africa, what we might think of as like Native American kind of tribal law, that's something that can have full force of the law as well. And that's spelled out in the Constitution as a specific power. So it's a little different, but I think that yeah, that's
Is
all.
that the asymmetrical federalism?
It wouldn't be asymmetrical, Chris. You're not listening because all the states can do it.
Ah,
It's asymmetrical just when it's like one province. Like let's say in North Dakota that there was going to be a special rights for those in North Dakota to do whatever y'all do there. Then that would be asymmetrical.
okay.
Mike just showed his knowledge of what goes on in North Dakota.
But normally it would be freezing our tails off right now, but it's actually a heat wave, so we're okay.
You're free to do whatever you people do up there.
I don't know.
All 780,000 of us.
On that note, students and teachers, we're going to bring it to our traditional close, and I'll ask the panel of scholars here to share their insights and recommendations as you prepare for the national finals. Professor Kavanaugh?
Well, I think this is, I mean, obviously, federalism is one of our favorite concepts, and it really is a concept that is at the heart of American constitutionalism. And as you've seen, we've kind of taken you through a broad swath of, oh my gosh, from the beginning to modern issues right now. And there's no clear-cut definitive answer about what's right and what's wrong. And I think this debate over sovereignty and federalism is ongoing because that's just who we are. It's in our nature as a people. Also, I would encourage you to go back and read Brandeis's Dissent. Remember, it is a dissent. So make sure you take a look at what the majority ruled in this case, even though I'm not sure that it comes into play, but it's always good to know that. Just think about all the examples within your lives, whether that be education, immigration, voting rights, abortion services. We see this F word played out constantly in our lives. So be aware of those things.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, I've been struck by two things in our discussion. Number one, Mike's analysis of, you've got marble cake federalism, layer cake federalism, cooperative federalism. So, look into those phases, because they have gone through there is a timeline to federalism. And I think I really appreciated Mike bringing that out. The other thought that I have is strictly personal. I don't know whether this actually will help students in this project, but well, I think it can, because David's question about laboratories of experimentation, or are they laboratories of obstructionism? This relationship between states and the national government. And I've been mulling about this for like 20 minutes now, and I've got a whole set of spider webs on my notes here. But I really like that. And that maybe that is the most fundamental question here. Is it a system of laboratories of democracy, or can we say it's a laboratory of obstructionism? And I think that's a nice way to think about this. I don't know if it's the right way, but it's interesting to do that.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, I have two things. In doing the research for this topic, I was really struck by this argument by Don Kettle about the inequality that stems from federalism. And I'll put a link into his book, but also this podcast interview with him that you can listen to. So I just have you think about, like, the structure we have is that if right now, if you happen to be born in Mississippi and you're a citizen of Mississippi, you're just going to have less access to resources for your health care than if you're born in California. It's what we find acceptable in the United States, given our federal system. So I would just have you kind of, I don't know, mull over that to think about what you think about that. And then what was my second point? I think I may have lost my second point. Oh no, it's follow the money. And Tim said something that this, because the federal government, the national government, has a good way of squashing out experimentation by just punishing states by not giving them funding. So whether that's with speed limits, within the homelessness sector, there's a national policy called Housing First. And if you don't subscribe to this policy, then the government will not send you the grant money to do your shelters and do other things. So there's a way that the national government has gotten around federalism to just say, all right, you can do what you want, but we're not going to give you this money that you desperately need if you don't follow what we think the policy should be. That's happened a lot with education, with healthcare. Yeah. So I would encourage you to keep that in mind as well as you're researching this.
Great point.
I would just close with to me, it seems like the 14th Amendment was intended to rearrange this whole federal relationship and experimentation, not to kill it, but only to really focus it on progressive experimentation, and that there would be a top-down incentive to change, that the federal government would play that role, especially when it comes to what our friend Kermit Hall had called the rights revolution, that we do see this downward force for states to adopt. Now I think that's kind of dead now to some degree, but to think about to what degree did the 14th Amendment, impact the federal system as far as that relationship and expanding democracy. So hopefully, again, I hope our discussion has given you some things to think about, shine some light on Brandeis and the Laboratories of Democracy. In our next session, let the Unit 2 students know that we'll be talking to them about Sentinel and aristocratic or aristocracy from Unit 2. Until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye. Bye bonds.